The moment the child turned his head, the room didn't just go quiet. It felt like time itself held its breath. The chandelier above cast a soft gold glow across the marble floor, reflections stretching like long shadows beneath polished shoes and tailored suits. But Ethan Cole didn't notice any of it. Not the quiet clink of champagne glasses, not the distant hum of conversation drifting through the private lounge on the 42nd floor, not even the skyline of Manhattan burning in amber light beyond the glass walls. Because his attention had locked onto something smaller, something still, something that didn't belong in a room built for billion-dollar deals and quiet power. A little boy standing near the edge of a velvet couch, one hand gripping the fabric as if anchoring himself in a world too large for his size, his curls catching the light in soft rings, his posture steady in a way that felt learned rather than natural. And then the boy looked up, just slightly, just enough for the light to catch his eyes. And Ethan felt something shift in his chest, not sharp, not immediate, but deep, like a memory pressing up from somewhere he hadn't visited in years. And for a second, just a second, he couldn't breathe. He didn't move right away, didn't step forward, didn't speak, because something about the stillness felt fragile, like any sudden motion might shatter whatever truth was trying to surface in front of him. And then he saw her. Amara Brooks stood just a few feet behind the child, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, not possessive, not protective in a dramatic way, just present, just certain, like she had been standing in that exact place for years without ever needing to announce it. Her posture straight, her expression calm, her eyes scanning the room with a quiet awareness that didn't ask for attention but commanded it anyway. And for a moment Ethan forgot how to process the distance between who she had been and who she was now, because the last time he had seen her, she had been standing under very different lights, not chandeliers but flickering fluorescence, not surrounded by executives but uncertainty, not steady but holding herself together, with something close to sheer will. And yet now, here she was, composed, contained, untouchable in a way that made the space around her feel smaller, and she hadn't even looked at him yet. The boy shifted slightly, adjusting his grip on the couch, and the movement was small, almost nothing, but it was enough to pull Ethan's focus back to him, back to the way his fingers curled, back to the quiet confidence in his stance, back to the way his eyes had held the light just a second ago. And Ethan felt that same pressure in his chest tighten, not into panic, not into fear, but into something far more dangerous. Recognition without permission, the kind that didn't ask if you were ready before it settled in, the kind that didn't explain itself but demanded to be acknowledged. And Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly as he tried to place it, tried to rationalize it, tried to push it into something explainable, because nothing about this made sense. Not here, not now. Not in a room where everything was supposed to be controlled and predictable and aligned with outcomes he had already calculated long before stepping inside. Someone spoke near him, a voice asking a question about a deal, a number, a timeline. But Ethan didn't answer, didn't even turn his head, because the world had narrowed in a way that made everything else irrelevant. And then, finally, Amara looked up. It wasn't sudden, wasn't dramatic, just a slow lift of her gaze, deliberate, measured, like she had felt him there long before she chose to acknowledge it. And when her eyes met his, there was no surprise, no confusion, no flicker of emotion that might have made this easier to understand. Just a calm, steady awareness that landed between them like a line already drawn, and Ethan felt the ground beneath the moment shift again. Because this wasn't chance, this wasn't coincidence, this wasn't a random crossing of paths in a city that thrived on them. This was something else, something quieter, something far more intentional, and the realization settled in without asking for permission. He took a step forward then, just one, slow, controlled, but the air felt different now, heavier, like the space itself was. Aware of what was unfolding, and the boy glanced up again, this time longer, this time directly, and Ethan saw it clearly, not as a suggestion, not as a passing thought, but as something undeniable, something etched into the shape of a face that hadn't existed in his world until now. The line of the jaw, the set of the eyes, the way the expression held steady instead of shifting under attention, and Ethan's breath caught. Not visibly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but enough that he felt it, enough that it disrupted the rhythm he had spent years mastering. and suddenly the silence between moments felt louder than anything else in the room. Amara's hand tightened slightly on the boy's shoulder, just enough to guide him back a step. Not hurried, not defensive, just enough to create distance. And that was when Ethan realized something else, something that pressed deeper than recognition, deeper than confusion, something that settled into a place he hadn't allowed himself to question in a long time. She was leaving before he could speak. She turned without a word, her movements smooth, unhurried, her hand guiding the boy gently but firmly, and Ethan felt something in him react, not with panic, not with urgency, but with a kind of clarity that cut through everything else, because whatever this was, whatever had just unfolded in the space of a few seconds, it wasn't something he could let walk out of the room unanswered. And yet, as he opened his mouth, as he prepared to close the distance, to speak her name, to ask the question, already forming whether he was ready for it or not, she didn't look back. The doors at the far end of the lounge opened with a soft, almost silent motion, the city lights spilling in around her silhouette, and for a moment she stood there, framed by glass and skyline and everything he had built his life around. And still, she didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him again, didn't offer a single word to anchor what had just happened in something real. And then she stepped through, the boy's small hand in hers, disappearing into a world that suddenly felt much larger than the one Ethan controlled. And the moment the door closed, the noise returned, the conversations resumed, the glasses clinked, the city kept moving like nothing had shifted at all. But Ethan didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink, because the only thing he could see was the reflection of that child's eyes in his mind. And the only thing he could hear was the question he hadn't asked, the one that now refused to stay quiet, the one that settled into his chest with a weight he couldn't ignore. Is he mine? The elevator door slid open with a soft chime, and Ethan Cole stepped inside without breaking stride, his reflection catching briefly in the mirrored walls. Sharp suit, steady posture, controlled expression, but his eyes were no longer focused on the man he had spent years becoming. They were fixed somewhere else entirely, replaying a moment that refused to settle into something logical, something contained, something he could file away and return to later, because this was not a business problem, not a negotiation, not a risk he could quantify or mitigate. This was something far more disruptive, something that had entered his world without warning and left behind a question that would not stay quiet. And as the doors closed behind him, sealing him into the quiet hum of the descending elevator, he exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but out of pressure, like something inside his chest had tightened just enough to remind him that he was no longer in control of the narrative he had built so carefully around himself. The city lights blurred past the glass as the elevator dropped, but he did not notice the speed, did not register the movement, because all he could see was that boy's face, the way the light had caught his eyes, the way his expression had held steady under attention, the way something about him had felt familiar in a way that made no sense and yet felt impossible to deny. And Ethan pressed his hand lightly against the cool metal railing beside him, grounding himself in something physical, something real, as his mind began to move through possibilities, each one more controlled than the last, each one attempting to explain what he had seen without allowing it to become what it was beginning to feel like. The doors opened into the lobby, and the world returned in fragments, the distant murmur of conversation, the quiet steps of people moving through polished floors, the subtle scent of cologne and city air blending together. But Ethan moved through it all without slowing, his focus narrowing into a single objective that had not existed 20 minutes ago. And by the time he reached the glass doors leading out to the street, his phone was already in his hand, his thumb hovering for only a fraction of a second before dialing a number he rarely used for anything outside of precision and necessity. "Marcus," he said the moment the line connected, his voice low, even, controlled, but carrying a weight that did not belong to routine instructions. And there was a brief pause on the other end, just long enough for recognition to settle. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, his tone immediate, attentive, already aligned. Ethan stepped out onto the sidewalk, the cool evening air brushing against his face, grounding him further, sharpening his focus, but not clearing the image in his mind. "I need information," Ethan continued, his gaze lifting slightly as he scanned the street, not for direction, but for orientation, as if placing himself back into a world that had just shifted without permission. A woman. Name is Amara Brooks. There was another pause, this one slightly longer, not from confusion, but from the weight of the request, because Ethan did not ask for information without purpose, and when he did, it was rarely personal. Understood, Marcus said finally. What specifically are we looking for? Ethan did not answer right away, not because he did not know, but because the words themselves carried a weight he had not yet fully allowed to settle. And for a moment he stood there, the city moving around him, headlights passing, footsteps echoing, voices blending into a distant hum, and he felt that same pressure in his chest return, not sharp, not urgent, but persistent, like something waiting to be acknowledged in full. Everything, he said at last, the word simple, but absolute. Current address, employment, any records you can find over the last 5 years. He paused then, just briefly, just enough for the next part to land with intention rather than impulse. And I want to know if she has a child. The silence on the other end stretched just slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition of the shift in tone, the shift in stakes. And when Marcus spoke again, his voice was still professional, still composed, but there was a subtle change, an awareness that this was no longer just another request. I will start immediately, he said. Ethan ended the call without another word, slipping the phone back into his pocket as he stepped toward the curb, but he did not signal for a car, did not move with the usual efficiency that defined his decisions, because something about this moment did not align with the pace he was used to. Something about it demanded a different kind of attention, a different kind of presence, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan allowed himself to stand still in the middle of a city that never did. His mind shifted then, not forward, not into strategy, but backward, into a space he had not revisited in years, a memory that had always felt contained, resolved, something he had done and moved on from without looking back, because at the time, it had been just that, a moment of intervention, a decision made quickly, cleanly, without expectation, without attachment, but now that memory felt different, heavier, like it carried pieces he had not seen before, pieces that had been there all along but had only just come into focus. It had been raining that night. He remembered that much clearly, the kind of steady rain that blurred the edges of the city, turning lights into streaks and sounds into something softer, something distant, and he had been leaving a late meeting, already focused on the next step, the next deal, the next decision, when he saw her, standing under the narrow overhang of a closed storefront, her shoulders slightly tense, her posture steady but guarded, like she had been standing there longer than she wanted to admit, and something about the way she held herself had caught his attention, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that demanded action, but in a way that lingered just long enough for him to stop. He had not asked many questions then, had not needed to, because the situation had been clear enough, a missed bus, a dead phone, a city that did not slow down for anyone who fell out of rhythm with it. And he had offered what he always offered in moments like that, a solution, direct, efficient, no expectations attached, a ride, a phone, a way out of a situation that did not need to become something larger, and she had accepted, not with hesitation, but with a kind of quiet dignity that had stayed with him longer than the moment itself, because she had not asked for help, had not leaned into it, had simply taken what was offered and held on to herself in a way that made it clear she was not defined by the circumstances she was standing in. They had not spoken much during that drive, just a few words, enough to exchange names, enough to establish presence, but not enough to create a connection he had thought would last beyond that night. And when he dropped her off, when she stepped out into the dim light of a street that felt far removed from the world he occupied, he had watched her for a moment, just long enough to see her straighten her shoulders, to see her walk forward without looking back, and then he had left, because that was what he did. He moved forward, always forward, never staying long enough for moments to become anything more than what they were. But now, standing under the glow of streetlights that felt far too similar to the ones in his memory, Ethan felt that moment shift, expand, take on a weight it had never carried before, because somewhere between that night and this one, something had changed, something had grown, something had been hidden in plain sight until it could no longer be ignored, and the image of that child returned again, sharper now, clearer, no longer just a passing resemblance, but something that demanded to be seen for what it might be, and Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, not in denial, but in acknowledgement, because whether he was ready or not, the question had already taken hold, and this time, it was not going away. The file arrived just after midnight, not with noise or urgency, but with a quiet certainty that made it feel heavier than anything Ethan had opened in years, and he did not reach for it immediately, did not flip it open the moment Marcus placed it on the glass table in his private office, because something about the stillness in the room told him this was not information he could simply read and move past. This was something that would settle, something that would stay. And as the city lights stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him, casting long reflections across polished surfaces and silent walls, Ethan stood with his hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, his gaze fixed on the file, like it might shift if he looked away for even a second, like the truth inside it might rearrange itself into something easier to accept if given the chance. Marcus did not speak right away, did not rush to summarize or highlight, because he knew Ethan well enough to understand that this was not about efficiency. This was about precision, about timing, about allowing the weight of the moment to settle before introducing anything that might alter it. And after a few seconds, he finally stepped forward just slightly, his voice calm, measured, but carrying a quiet gravity that matched the tone of the room. "Her name is still Amara Brooks," he said, his words deliberate, each one placed carefully as if building something that could not be taken back once completed. "She has been living in Brooklyn for the past 4 years. She works part-time at a community art center and does freelance design work from home." Ethan did not move, did not respond, but his focus sharpened, narrowing into the details as they formed a picture he had not known existed until now. There are no legal records tying her to any significant incidents, no criminal history, no financial red flags. Marcus continued, his tone steady, but there was a pause then, brief, controlled, just enough to signal a shift. "She has a son." The words landed without sound, but Ethan felt them, not as impact, not as shock, but as confirmation of something that had already begun to take shape in his mind long before this moment. And for a second, the room seemed to hold its breath again, echoing the silence from earlier that night, the silence that had followed the moment he saw the boy's face. And Ethan's hand tightened slightly against the edge of the table, not visibly, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough for him to feel it, enough to ground him in the reality of what was unfolding. "His name is Noah Brooks," Marcus added, his voice softer now, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because this was no longer just information. This was something else entirely, something that reached beyond data and into something far more personal. "He is 4 years old." 4 years. Ethan repeated silently, the number settling into place with a precision that made his chest tighten, because 4 years was not a vague span, not something that could be dismissed or overlooked. It was exact, it was measurable, it was aligned with a timeline he could not ignore, and his mind moved quickly then, not with panic, but with calculation, tracing back through moments he had not considered significant at the time, aligning dates, aligning locations, aligning the memory of a rainy night with the quiet weight of a possibility he had not allowed himself to fully consider until now. "Do you have a photo?" Ethan asked finally, his voice low, controlled, but carrying an edge that had not been there before, and Marcus nodded once, reaching into the file and sliding a single photograph across the table with careful precision, placing it just within Ethan's reach without forcing the moment forward. Ethan did not pick it up immediately, did not rush to confirm what he already felt pressing against his certainty, because something about that small rectangle of paper felt like a threshold, like the point where speculation ended and truth began, and for a brief second, he allowed himself to stand on the edge of that line, to exist in the space where nothing had been confirmed yet, where the question still held more power than the answer. But then he reached for it. The photograph was simple, not staged, not posed, just a moment captured in natural light. Amara sitting on a park bench, her posture relaxed but attentive, her hand resting lightly on the shoulder of a small boy standing beside her. His face turned slightly toward the camera, his expression calm, steady, and the moment Ethan's eyes landed on that face, the world around him narrowed again, not gradually, not subtly, but completely, because there was no longer any space for doubt, no room for interpretation, no angle that could shift what he was seeing into something else. The resemblance was not just similarity, it was undeniable, etched into the shape of a face that mirrored his own in ways that could not be explained away. And Ethan felt something inside him shift, not breaking, not collapsing, but moving, like a structure he had built over years had just adjusted under a weight he had never accounted for. He exhaled slowly, his gaze still fixed on the photograph, his mind no longer searching for alternatives, no longer trying to control the narrative, because the truth was no longer something that needed to be uncovered. It was something that had already been placed in front of him, clear, undeniable, and waiting to be acknowledged. "She never contacted me," he said quietly, not as a question, not as an accusation, but as a realization spoken aloud, and Marcus shook his head once. "There is no record of any attempt," he confirmed. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, not in frustration, but in something far more complex, something that sat between understanding and disbelief, because he knew what that meant. He understood the implication behind silence that lasted for years, behind a decision that required strength he had not seen coming. And for a moment, the image of Amara standing in that lounge earlier that night returned, her posture steady, her expression calm, her silence intentional, and he saw it differently now, not as distance, not as avoidance, but as control, as choice, as a line she had drawn long before he realized he had crossed it. Ethan set the photograph down carefully, his movements controlled, deliberate, as if placing it too quickly might disrupt something he was still trying to understand, and he straightened slightly, his gaze lifting toward the window where the city stretched endlessly beyond. His reach, a world he had always moved through with certainty, with control, with the confidence that every outcome could be shaped if approached correctly. But this was different. This was not something he had planned for, not something he had influenced. This was something that had existed entirely outside of his awareness, growing, forming, becoming real without his presence, without his input, without his permission. And the weight of that realization settled deeper than anything else had. That night, "Find out where she will be tomorrow," he said finally, his voice steady again, but different now, grounded in something that was no longer just curiosity or suspicion, but purpose. Marcus nodded once. "Yes, sir." Ethan did not look back at the file, did not pick up the photograph again, because he did not need to. The image was already fixed in his mind, clear, unchanging, impossible to ignore, and as he turned toward the window, his reflection staring back at him against the backdrop of a city that suddenly felt unfamiliar, he understood something with a clarity that left no room for hesitation. Whatever this was, whatever had been hidden for 4 years, it was no longer something he could stand outside of, and this time, he was not going to let it walk away unanswered. The next morning did not rush him. It waited, stretched thin across the early light pouring through the city, pale gold sliding between buildings, and settling quietly over the streets of Brooklyn where life moved differently, slower, grounded in something Ethan had not stepped into in years. And yet he was there before the doors opened, standing across the street from a modest brick building with a small painted sign that read Brookline Community Arts Center, his car idling behind him, engine humming low like it understood the stillness of the moment better than he did. And for once, he did not step out immediately, did not move with the efficiency that defined every other part of his life, because this was not a boardroom, not a negotiation, not a space where presence alone commanded outcomes. This was a place where he had no authority, no leverage, only a question that had followed him through the night and settled into something heavier by morning. Children began to arrive in small clusters, backpacks bouncing lightly against their shoulders, laughter cutting through the quiet air in ways that felt unfiltered and real, and Ethan watched them without really seeing them, his focus narrowing to the entrance, waiting, not impatiently, but with a kind of controlled anticipation that pressed against his ribs, and then she appeared. Amara stepped out from the building with a calm that did not belong to someone trying to avoid anything, her posture steady, her movements deliberate, her presence unchanged from the night before, except now, in the clear light of day, there was no distance created by shadows or reflections, nothing to soften the reality of her existence in a world completely separate from his. And beside her, just slightly behind her, was the boy. Noah held her hand loosely, not clinging, not hesitant, just connected in a way that felt practiced, natural, and as they moved down the steps, Ethan felt that same stillness settle into him again, the kind that came not from hesitation, but from awareness, because this was no longer a moment caught by chance. This was something he had stepped into deliberately, and now he could not step out without answers. He opened the car door slowly, stepping onto the sidewalk with measured control, the cool air grounding him, anchoring him in the present as he crossed the short distance between them, each step precise, not rushed, not aggressive, just enough to close the space without disrupting it entirely. And Amara saw him before he spoke. Her eyes lifted, calm, steady, no surprise, no visible reaction, just recognition, as if she had already expected this moment to arrive, as if his presence here was not an intrusion, but a continuation of something she had already accounted for. And that realization shifted something in Ethan again, because it meant she had been prepared for this in a way he had not, and for a brief second, the control he was used to holding slipped just enough for him to feel it. Noah glanced up then, his gaze moving from his mother to Ethan with quiet curiosity, not fear, not confusion, just observation, and Ethan felt the weight of that small attention settle into his chest, because it was different now, standing here, close enough to see the details clearly, the exact shape of his features, the subtle expressions that mirrored his own in ways that did not need explanation. And for a moment, he forgot the words he had planned, forgot the structure he had built overnight, because none of it felt adequate in the presence of something this simple and this undeniable. Amara, he said finally, his voice low, controlled, but softer than it had been the night before, and she did not respond immediately, did not fill the space with unnecessary words. She simply waited, her posture unchanged, her hand still resting lightly over Noah's. And that silence spoke more clearly than anything else could have. It set the boundary, defined the terms, made it clear that whatever this conversation would become, it would not be dictated by him alone. Ethan exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but out of recalibration, adjusting to a dynamic he had not navigated before, and he glanced briefly at Noah before returning his focus to her. "I need to talk to you," he continued, each word measured, deliberate, but carrying the weight of everything that had led him here. And Amara's expression did not change, did not soften or harden. It simply remained steady, grounded in a kind of quiet strength that made it clear she was not here to react. She was here to decide. "You should have thought about that 4 years ago," she said, her voice even, not raised, not sharp, just direct, and the words landed without force but with precision, cutting through any illusion that this moment belonged to him. Ethan held her gaze, absorbing the statement, not deflecting it, not challenging it, because there was nothing in it that he could deny, and for a second, the noise of the street faded again, leaving only the space between them and the weight of everything unspoken pressing into it. Noah shifted slightly at her side, his small fingers tightening just a fraction around hers, and Amara's hand adjusted instinctively, not drawing attention, just reinforcing the connection, and Ethan noticed that too, noticed the ease of it, the way her focus remained split but unwavering, anchored in both presence and protection without effort, and something about that steadiness forced him to choose his next words carefully, because this was not a conversation he could control with logic alone. "Is he mine?" he asked, the question leaving him without hesitation, without embellishment, just as it had formed, direct, unguarded, and the moment it settled into the air, everything else seemed to pause around it. The distant traffic, the soft laughter of children behind them, even the wind that moved lightly through the street, because this was the line, the one that separated speculation from truth, the one that could not be taken back once crossed. Amara did not answer right away, did not react with shock or anger. She simply looked at him, her gaze steady, unflinching, and in that silence, there was no confusion, no uncertainty, only choice, deliberate and controlled. And after a few seconds, she glanced down at Noah, her expression softening just slightly, not in weakness, but in something deeper, something rooted in care and responsibility, before lifting her eyes back to Ethan. "You do not get to ask that like it is just another question," she said quietly, her voice still even, still calm, but carrying a weight that settled far deeper than anything louder could have, and Ethan felt it, not as resistance, but as truth, as something earned, something built over years he had not been part of, and for the first time since this began, he understood that whatever answer he was seeking, it was not something he was entitled to receive without consequence. He nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the shift, the boundary, the reality of the space he had stepped into, and he did not push forward immediately, did not demand, did not argue, because something in her tone made it clear that this was not a door he could force open. It was one he would have to stand in front of, waiting, proving, understanding, and as Noah looked up at him again, his small face calm, observant, carrying a familiarity that no longer felt like coincidence, Ethan realized that the truth was already there, present in the space between them, whether it had been spoken or not, and this time, walking away was no longer an option. The space between them did not break after her words. It held, stretched thin but steady, like something carefully balanced that neither of them was willing to tip too soon, and Ethan remained where he stood, not stepping closer, not retreating, simply existing in the line she had drawn, because for the first time in a long time, he understood that movement alone would not get him what he wanted. This was not about closing distance. It was about earning space, and that realization settled into him with a weight that felt unfamiliar but necessary. Noah shifted again beside her, his small hand loosening from hers as his attention drifted towards something behind Ethan, a delivery truck rolling slowly past, its low rumble drawing his eyes for a moment before he looked back, and there was a pause, a quiet, natural pause that belonged to a child observing the world without the tension layered between the adults around him, and then he spoke. "Mom, is he coming with us?" The question was simple, soft, without any awareness of the weight it carried, but the effect was immediate, not in volume, not in reaction, but in the way it landed, because for a second, everything shifted again, the air, the space, the distance between them, and Ethan felt it settle deeper than anything that had been said so far, because that single word, us, placed him outside of something real, something formed, something complete without him, and it was not said with rejection, it was said with innocence, which made it impossible to ignore. Amara's grip on Noah's hand tightened slightly, just enough to bring his attention back to her, and she looked down at him, her expression softening in a way Ethan had not seen before, not guarded, not controlled, just present, grounded in a warmth that did not need to be explained. "No, baby," she said gently, her voice low, steady, the same calm tone she had used with Ethan but different in its texture, because this was not a boundary, this was reassurance. "He is not coming with us." The words were simple, but they carried a finality that did not need to be emphasized, and Noah nodded once, accepting the answer without question, his focus already shifting forward again, his world moving on in a way that made the moment feel both smaller and heavier at the same time. Ethan did not react immediately, did not interrupt, did not attempt to insert himself into the space that had just been defined without him, because something about that exchange settled deeper than anything else had so far. It was not about the answer, it was about the position it placed him in, outside, observing something that had existed without his presence for 4 years, something that had grown, stabilized, and found its own rhythm without ever needing to account for him. And for the first time, the weight of that absence felt real, not theoretical, not something he could measure and correct, but something lived, something carried by another person in ways he had never seen. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself, not to regain control, but to remain present, because walking away now, even silently, would not change what had already been set in motion, and he met Amara's gaze again, not with demand, not with assumption, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement that had not been there before. "I did not know," he said, his voice even, not defensive, not searching for absolution, just stating what was true from his perspective, and for a second, the words seemed to settle into the space between them without resistance, not accepted, not rejected, just existing as part of the reality they were both navigating. Amara studied him for a moment, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, and there was no immediate response, no quick dismissal or agreement, just silence, and in that silence, there was thought, consideration, something deeper than reaction, and when she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, grounded, but the weight behind it shifted slightly, not softer, not harsher, just clearer. "You did not know because you left," she said, not as an accusation, not raised, just precise, each word placed exactly where it needed to be, and Ethan felt it, not as a strike, but as a correction, as something that realigned the narrative he had been holding on to since the night before, because this was not just about absence, it was about the reason behind it, and that reason did not exist in isolation, it existed in choices he had made without understanding their reach. He nodded once, slowly, accepting the statement without argument, because there was no part of it he could deny, and for a moment, the street around them felt distant again, the movement of the city continuing without interruption while something far more contained unfolded between them. Noah tugged lightly at her hand, his attention shifting toward the building behind her again, where other children were beginning to gather near the entrance, voices rising in soft laughter, and Amara glanced down at him briefly before looking back at Ethan, her expression returning to that steady, controlled calm that defined every movement she made. "We are going to be late," she said simply, not as an excuse, not as avoidance, just as a fact, and the way she said it made it clear that this moment, no matter how significant it felt to him, did not override the life she had built, the responsibilities she carried, the rhythm she maintained every single day without him. Ethan understood that, not instantly, but enough to recognize that pushing further right now would not give him what he was looking for. It would only reinforce the distance she had already established, and for a second, he considered stepping back, letting her leave, letting the moment close without forcing it open further. But the question in his chest did not fade. It did not soften. It remained steady, persistent. And this time, he chose to stay. "I am not asking to take anything from you," he said, his voice low, controlled, but carrying something new beneath it, something that was not about authority or outcome, but about presence, about recognition. "I am asking for the truth." The words settled into the space carefully, not pushing, not demanding, just placed, and Amara held his gaze, her expression unreadable for a moment, her silence stretching just enough to make it clear that this was not a question she would answer lightly, not now, not under pressure, not because he had asked. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders remaining steady, her posture unchanged, and then she spoke, her voice calm, unwavering, grounded in something that did not need to rise in volume to carry weight. "The truth is not something you walk into and claim," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "It is something you live with." The statement did not answer his question directly, but it did something else. It reframed it, shifted it from something immediate into something that extended beyond this moment, beyond this conversation, into something that would require more than a single exchange to understand, and Ethan felt that shift settle into him, not as frustration, but as clarity, because for the first time since this began, he understood that this was not about a single answer. It was about everything that had led to it, everything that had been carried in silence for years, everything that could not be reduced to a yes or no without losing what made it real. Noah looked between them again, his small brow furrowing slightly in quiet curiosity, sensing something he could not fully understand, and Amara adjusted her grip on his hand once more, grounding him, steadying him, and then she stepped back, just one step, enough to signal movement, enough to begin the process of leaving without turning away completely. "We have to go," she said, her tone final but not harsh, simply closing the moment on her terms, and for a second, Ethan did not move, did not respond, because the weight of everything that had just unfolded settled into him all at once, not overwhelming, but undeniable, and as she turned, guiding Noah forward, his small hand in hers, their pace steady, unhurried, Ethan remained where he stood, watching, not with detachment, not with control, but with a realization that had finally taken full shape. Whatever this was, whatever truth existed between them, it was no longer something he could approach like a problem to solve. It was something he would have to step into, fully, patiently, without the certainty he was used to, and this time, he was not going to turn away. He did not follow them immediately, and that was the first decision Ethan Cole made that did not come from instinct, not from urgency, but from something slower, something measured, because as Amara and Noah walked away, their steps steady, their rhythm untouched by his presence, he realized that chasing them now would not bring him closer. It would only confirm everything she had already said without raising her voice. And so he stayed where he was, hands at his sides, shoulders still, watching until they disappeared through the glass doors of the building, the reflection swallowing them into a space he could not enter without permission. And the moment the door closed behind them, the street returned to its normal pace. Cars passing, voices rising, the city continuing without pause. But something inside him had shifted in a way that did not move with it. He turned slowly, not with defeat, not with frustration, but with intention, and walked back toward his car, each step grounded, deliberate, like he was adjusting to a new pace that did not allow shortcuts. And when he opened the door and sat inside, he did not start the engine right away, did not reach for his phone, did not fall back into the patterns that had defined him for years. He simply sat there, the quiet of the interior wrapping around him, separating him from the noise outside, giving him space to think in a way he had not needed to in a long time. His reflection stared back at him faintly in the darkened glass, layered over the movement of the street, and for a moment, he saw himself differently, not as the man who controlled outcomes, not as the one who stepped into situations with clarity and left with resolution, but as someone standing at the edge of something he did not fully understand yet, something that required more than precision, more than strategy, something that required patience, and that realization settled into him with a weight that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome. He reached for his phone then, not with urgency, but with purpose, and dialed Marcus again, the line connecting almost immediately. "Yes, sir," Marcus answered, his tone steady as always, but there was a subtle awareness beneath it now, an understanding that this situation had moved beyond routine. Ethan leaned back slightly in his seat, his gaze lifting toward the building across the street, where the doors had already closed behind Amara and Noah. "I do not want any interference," he said, his voice calm, even, but carrying a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. "No pressure, no legal contact, no indirect approaches. This stays contained." There was a brief pause on the other end, not from confusion, but from recalibration, because this was not the kind of instruction Ethan typically gave, not in matters that involved unknown variables, and when Marcus responded, his voice carried that understanding. "Understood," he said. "Observation only." Ethan nodded slightly, even though Marcus could not see him. "And I want a full schedule," he added. "Not to disrupt, just to understand." The distinction mattered, and he knew it, because this was not about control anymore. It was about awareness, about stepping into a reality that had existed without him and learning how to exist within it without breaking it. He ended the call and set the phone down beside him, his hand resting lightly against the steering wheel, and for a moment, he allowed the silence to return, not empty, but full, filled with the weight of everything he had seen, everything he had heard, everything that had shifted in the last 24 hours. The image of Noah returned again, not as a question this time, but as something more solid, more defined, the way he had stood, the way he had spoken, the way his presence had carried a quiet confidence that felt both familiar and entirely new. And Ethan exhaled slowly, not in disbelief, but in acknowledgement, because whether or not the words had been spoken yet, the truth was already there, living in the space between them, undeniable in a way that did not require confirmation to exist. He started the engine then, the low hum breaking the stillness inside the car, and pulled away from the curb with measured ease, merging into the flow of traffic without drawing attention, without disrupting anything. And as the building faded behind him, he did not look back, not because he was finished, but because he understood that this was not something that could be resolved in a single moment. This was something that would unfold, slowly, deliberately, on terms that were not his alone. The rest of the day did not follow its usual pattern. Meetings were shortened, calls were delegated, decisions were made with efficiency, but without the depth he normally applied, because part of his focus remained elsewhere, anchored in a place he had only just stepped into. And by the time the sun began to lower again, casting long shadows across the city, he found himself standing once more at the edge of a different space, one that did not belong to him, but that he was beginning to understand. The community center was quieter in the late afternoon, the earlier noise of children replaced by a softer rhythm, a few voices echoing lightly through open windows, the faint sound of music drifting out, and Ethan remained across the street again, not hiding, not approaching, simply present, observing, learning the shape of a life he had not known existed. Through the glass, he could see movement, figures shifting in the space, colors scattered across tables, and then he saw them again. Amara stood near a long table, her sleeves rolled slightly, her hands guiding a small group of children as they painted, her posture relaxed but attentive, her focus split effortlessly between instruction and awareness, and Noah sat nearby, his small hands moving carefully over a sheet of paper, his concentration steady, his presence grounded in a way that felt natural, unforced, and Ethan felt something shift again. Not as a question this time, not as uncertainty, but as something deeper, something that settled into a place he had not allowed himself to access before, because this was not just about resemblance, not just about possibility. This was about reality, about a life that had been built, nurtured, protected without him, and the clarity of that truth did not push him away, it pulled him in, not with urgency, but with purpose. He watched as Noah looked up briefly, his gaze scanning the room before landing near the window, and for a fraction of a second, their eyes met again. Not long, not dramatic, just a moment. And then the boy looked back down at his drawing, unaffected, unaware of the weight of that connection, and Ethan felt it settle deeper than anything else had so far, because there was no expectation in it, no demand, just existence. And for the first time since this began, he understood something with quiet certainty. Whatever this path required, whatever time it demanded, whatever patience it tested, he was not going to step away from it. Not now, not again, because this was no longer just about a question, it was about everything that came after the answer. The light inside the community center softened as the afternoon stretched toward evening, long shadows forming across the wooden floors while the quiet hum of activity settled into something slower, something more intimate, and Ethan remained where he stood outside, not hidden, not fully visible either, simply present in a space that did not belong to him yet, observing without interruption, learning without speaking, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to exist without directing the outcome of what he was watching. Inside, Amara moved between the tables with a steady rhythm, her voice low, guiding, encouraging, never raising, never forcing, and there was a calm authority in the way the children responded to her, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but out of trust, and Ethan noticed that, the kind of trust that was not given easily, the kind that was built over time through consistency, through presence, through showing up again and again without fail, and something about that realization pressed deeper than anything else had so far, because it stood in direct contrast to everything he had not been. Noah sat near the corner of the table now, his small frame leaning slightly forward as he concentrated on his drawing, his fingers moving with careful intention, and every few seconds, he would glance up, not searching, not distracted, just checking, making sure his mother was still there, and every time his eyes found her, even for a brief second, something in his posture relaxed again, something settled, and Ethan felt that too, not in a way that belonged to him, but in a way that made him understand the structure of the bond in front of him, the quiet, unspoken connection that did not need to be explained or reinforced because it had already been lived into existence. The door to the center opened then, and a breeze moved through the room, carrying with it the faint sounds of the street, the distant rhythm of the city continuing its pace, and Amara glanced up briefly, her eyes moving toward the entrance, and for a moment, she saw him. There was no visible reaction, no pause in her movement, no shift in her posture, just recognition, calm and steady, as if his presence outside had already been accounted for, as if this was not an intrusion, but a continuation of something she had already decided how to handle, and that realization settled into Ethan again, reinforcing what he was beginning to understand, that this was not a situation he could step into and reshape. This was something he would have to step into carefully, respectfully, without expecting immediate access or immediate answers. He did not move when their eyes met, did not step forward or look away. He simply held the moment for what it was, quiet, unspoken, grounded in awareness, and after a second, she returned her attention to the children, her focus shifting seamlessly back into the space she controlled, the space she had built, and Ethan remained outside, the distance between them unchanged but no longer undefined. Minutes passed, then more, the room gradually emptying as parents arrived to pick up their children, voices soft, footsteps echoing lightly as small hands were gathered, backpacks lifted, goodbyes exchanged, and eventually, only a few remained, Noah among them, still seated, still focused, his drawing now filled with color, shapes forming something that held his attention fully, and Amara moved toward him, crouching slightly beside him, her voice low as she spoke, her hand brushing lightly against his shoulder in a gesture so natural it almost went unnoticed. But Ethan saw it, every detail, every small movement that defined a relationship built over time, and the weight of that reality settled into him with a clarity that left no room for denial. When Noah finally stood, gathering his things with the careful precision of someone who had learned routine, Amara took his hand again, guiding him toward the door, and this time, when they stepped outside, Ethan did not stay back. He moved forward, not quickly, not abruptly, but with intention, closing the space just enough to be part of the moment without disrupting it entirely. Noah looked up first, his gaze landing on Ethan with that same quiet curiosity, his expression open, unguarded, and Ethan felt something shift again, something deeper this time, because standing here, in the open air, with no glass between them, no distance softened by reflection, the reality of the connection became even more present, even more undeniable, and for a moment, he allowed himself to feel it without pushing it away, without trying to control it. Amara's eyes followed, lifting to meet his, her expression unchanged, steady, aware, and for a second, none of them spoke, the space holding a quiet tension that was not hostile, not aggressive, just real, grounded in everything that had been left unsaid. Ethan exhaled slowly, grounding himself before speaking, not rushing, not forcing the moment forward. "I am not leaving," he said, his voice calm, measured, but carrying a clarity that had not been there before, and the words settled into the air without weight, not as a challenge, not as a demand, just as a statement of presence. And Amara studied him for a moment, her gaze steady, searching not for the words themselves, but for what stood behind them. "That is your choice," she replied, her tone even, not inviting, not dismissing, simply acknowledging the reality he had just set in motion, and Ethan nodded slightly, accepting that, because this was no longer about permission, it was about consistency, about showing up in a way that matched the weight of what he was beginning to understand. Noah shifted closer to Amara then, his small hand tightening around hers as he looked between them, sensing the shift without fully understanding it, and Ethan crouched slightly, lowering himself just enough to meet the boy at eye level, his posture open, his expression calm, careful, not to impose, careful not to assume, and for a brief second, the world seemed to narrow again, not into silence, but into focus, because this was the first time he was not observing from a distance. This was the first time he was close enough to feel the presence directly, unfiltered, and the weight of that moment settled into him with a quiet intensity. "Hi, Noah," he said gently, his voice softer now, stripped of the control he used everywhere else, and the boy blinked once, his head tilting slightly, as if processing something new, something unexpected, and then he nodded, a small, simple motion that carried no fear, no hesitation, just acknowledgement, and Ethan felt that too, the simplicity of it, the openness of it, something that did not belong to contracts or negotiations or controlled environments, something that existed without conditions, and for the first time since this began, he understood that whatever this path required, it would not be built on what he had, it would be built on what he was willing to become. The moment lingered longer than it should have, stretched between three people standing on a quiet Brooklyn sidewalk as the last of the afternoon light slipped into evening, soft and golden against the buildings, and Ethan remained crouched at Noah's level, not moving closer, not reaching out, simply holding the space with a kind of stillness that did not belong to the man he used to be. And Noah studied him for a second longer, his eyes curious but calm, not searching for answers, not demanding explanation, just observing in the way children do when something new enters their world without warning, but without threat. Amara did not interrupt, did not pull Noah away, but her presence remained steady, grounded, her hand still lightly wrapped around his, a quiet anchor that never loosened, and Ethan noticed that too, the balance she maintained, allowing the moment without surrendering control of it, and something about that quiet strength pressed deeper into him than anything she had said out loud. "We should go," she said after a few seconds, her voice calm, not sharp, not rushed, simply moving the moment forward on her terms, and Noah nodded. Once, accepting the shift without resistance, his attention already beginning to drift toward the familiar rhythm of what came next, the walk home, the small routines that shaped his world in ways Ethan could only begin to imagine. Ethan rose slowly, not breaking the calm that had settled between them, and stepped back just enough to give them space to pass, his posture open, his movements deliberate, and as they walked past him, he did not try to stop them, did not insert himself into the path. He simply turned and walked alongside them, not too close, not too far, matching their pace without forcing it. And for a moment, none of them spoke. The quiet hum of the city filling the space instead, distant traffic, footsteps, the low murmur of evening life settling in. Noah walked between them but slightly closer to Amara, his small steps steady, his gaze shifting between the sidewalk ahead and the world around him, and every so often, he would glance sideways at Ethan, quick, curious looks that carried no fear, only awareness, and Ethan felt each one, not as pressure, but as something else, something fragile, something that required him to move carefully, to exist without overwhelming what had already been built. "Why are you here?" Amara asked finally, her voice low, not confrontational, but direct, and Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he did not have an answer, but because he understood now that the way he answered mattered more than the words themselves. "Because I should have been," he said after a moment, his tone steady, not defensive, not trying to justify, just stating something that had become clear to him in the last 24 hours, and Amara's gaze remained forward, her expression unreadable, absorbing the words without reacting to them, and that silence held again, not empty, but full, filled with the weight of everything that had not been said for years. They reached the corner then, the crosswalk light blinking softly as cars slowed, and Noah stopped instinctively, his hand tightening around Amara's, his small body leaning slightly into her without thinking, and she adjusted her grip, grounding him, her presence unwavering, and Ethan stood just to the side, watching, not interfering, not stepping in, allowing the moment to remain theirs, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to fill the silence. He let it exist, let it breathe, let it show him something he had not known before. When the light changed, they crossed together, the movement simple, ordinary, but to Ethan, it felt different, like stepping into a rhythm he had not been part of but was beginning to learn. And on the other side, Noah spoke again, his voice small but clear. "Mom, is he your friend?" The question was simple, innocent, but it carried a weight that settled differently this time, because it was not about exclusion, it was about definition, about understanding where someone fit in a world that had already been shaped without them. And Amara's steps slowed just slightly, her gaze shifting down to Noah, before lifting briefly toward Ethan, and for a second, there was something there, not softness, not resistance, something more complex, something measured. "No," she said gently, her voice calm, steady. "He is someone we know." The distinction was clear, precise, and Ethan felt it, not as rejection, but as reality, as a place on a line that had not yet moved, and he accepted it without pushing, without trying to redefine it before its time. Noah nodded once, satisfied with the answer, his attention already moving forward again, and the moment passed as simply as it had come, but its impact remained, settling into Ethan with a clarity that made one thing certain. He was not here to claim a place, he was here to earn it. They reached the building a few minutes later, a modest brownstone with worn steps and a small light glowing beside the door, and Amara paused at the base, turning slightly toward him, her posture still composed, her presence still grounded in control, and for a second, the quiet returned again, the same stillness that had defined every moment between them so far. "You should not come here," she said, her voice even, not harsh, not defensive, just firm, setting a boundary that did not need explanation, and Ethan met her gaze, not challenging, not dismissing, simply understanding the line she was drawing, because this was not about keeping him out, it was about protecting what was inside. He nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the boundary without argument. "Then tell me where I should be," he replied, his tone steady, not pushing, not demanding, but offering something different this time. Not control, not authority, but willingness, and Amara studied him for a moment, her eyes searching not for the words, but for what stood behind them, and the silence stretched just long enough to make the moment feel balanced on something fragile, something that could shift with the smallest movement. "You should be patient," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm, and the words settled into him with a weight that felt heavier than any instruction he had been given before, because patience was not something he had ever needed to practice, not in a world that moved at his pace, not in a life where outcomes were shaped by action, but here, now, it was the only thing that mattered. Noah tugged gently at her hand again, his attention already turning toward the door, and Amara shifted her focus back to him. The moment with Ethan closing without ceremony, without finality, just a quiet pause in something that had only just begun. And as she guided Noah up the steps, Ethan remained where he stood, watching, not with urgency, not with expectation, but with a steady understanding that this was not about what he could do next. It was about what he was willing to wait for. And, for the first time in a long time, he did not move to change the outcome. He let it unfold. The door closed softly behind them, the quiet click echoing longer than it should have in the stillness of the evening. And Ethan remained at the bottom of the steps, his gaze fixed on the place where they had disappeared, not expecting it to open again, not waiting for a second invitation, just standing in the space where the moment had ended and something else had begun, something slower, something that did not move on command. And for the first time in years, he allowed that to be enough. He turned eventually, not abruptly, not with hesitation, but with a quiet understanding that staying longer would not change what had just been said. And as he stepped back onto the sidewalk, the city seemed different, not louder, not quieter, just more present, like every sound and movement had sharpened in response to something inside him shifting. And he walked without direction for a few blocks, not calling for a car, not checking his phone, just moving, letting the rhythm of his steps match the pace of something he was still learning how to follow. The streetlights flickered on one by one as dusk settled fully into night, casting warm pools of light across the pavement, and Ethan slowed near the corner of a small park, his attention drawn to the quiet movement inside. A few children still playing under the watch of tired parents, laughter drifting through the air in soft bursts. And he stopped there for a moment, not stepping inside, not engaging, just observing, because something about it felt familiar now in a way it had not before, not because he had been part of it, but because he had seen its absence, and that difference mattered more than he expected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, staring at the screen for a second before dialing, the line connecting almost immediately. "Marcus," he said, his voice low, steady, but carrying a different kind of focus now, something less about control and more about intention. "Yes, sir," Marcus responded, his tone consistent but attentive. Ethan exhaled lightly, his gaze still fixed on the park. "I want everything you gathered to stay private," he said, his words deliberate. "No reports forwarded, no digital trail beyond what is necessary. This does not leave us." There was a brief pause, then a simple, "Understood." Ethan nodded slightly, even though it could not be seen. "And stop the schedule updates," he added after a moment. "I will not track them like a routine." The words settled with a quiet finality, marking a shift that Marcus did not question, only acknowledged. "Yes, sir." Ethan ended the call and lowered the phone, slipping it back into his pocket. And for a moment, he stood there, letting the quiet settle around him again, because what he had just done mattered, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that would change everything overnight, but in a way that shifted how he approached what came next, because this was no longer about gathering information, it was about earning understanding. The following morning came without urgency, the sunlight filtering through his penthouse windows in long, clean lines, illuminating a space that had always felt controlled, precise, untouched by anything unpredictable. And yet now, standing there, coffee untouched on the counter, Ethan felt the distance between that world and the one he had stepped into the day before, and it did not feel temporary. It felt real, like something he could not simply step out of when it became inconvenient. He dressed without rushing, his movements steady, his thoughts clear in a way they had not been before, not because he had answers, but because he had direction. And when he left, it was not for a meeting, not for a deal, it was for something far less defined, something that required presence rather than strategy. The community center came into view again as he approached, the morning light softer now, the building quieter than the day before, and this time, he did not stop across the street. He walked directly to the door, his steps measured, his posture open, and when he reached it, he paused, not out of hesitation, but out of respect, because this was not a space he could enter without acknowledgement, and he knocked lightly, the sound carrying just enough to announce his presence without demanding attention. A few seconds passed before the door opened, and a woman he had not seen before stood there, her expression polite but cautious, her posture protective of the space behind her. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone neutral, and Ethan inclined his head slightly, his voice calm. "I am here to see Amara Brooks," he said, not pushing, not assuming access, just stating his purpose. And the woman studied him for a moment, weighing something he could not see, before stepping aside just slightly. "She is in the back," she said, her tone still measured, and Ethan nodded once in thanks before stepping inside. The shift immediate, the atmosphere different from the outside world, quieter, grounded, filled with the faint scent of paint and paper and something else, something lived in. He moved through the space slowly, not rushing, not intruding, and when he reached the back room, he saw her again. Amara stood near the window, sorting through supplies, her movements steady, her focus complete, and for a moment, he simply watched, not speaking, not interrupting, because something about the simplicity of the scene held more weight than anything else he could say. She turned before he announced himself, her awareness sharp, her expression unchanged, and when her eyes met his, there was no surprise, no shift, just recognition, and for a second, the room felt smaller, the air quieter, like the world outside had stepped back to allow this moment to settle. "You came anyway," she said, her voice calm, not accusing, just acknowledging, and Ethan nodded slightly. "You told me to be patient," he replied, his tone steady, not invisible. The words hung between them, not as a challenge, but as a statement of intent, and Amara held his gaze for a moment longer, her expression unreadable, before glancing briefly toward the hallway where faint voices echoed, and then back to him. "This is not your world," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that did not need to rise, and Ethan did not argue, did not correct her, because he understood what she meant, and for once, he did not try to redefine it. "Then I will learn how to stand in it without breaking it," he said, his voice softer now, not controlled, not calculated, just honest in a way he had not needed to be before, and the silence that followed was different this time, not tense, not guarded, just open, like something had shifted slightly, not enough to change everything, but enough to move the line forward by a fraction, and for now, that was enough. The quiet in the room did not break after his words. It shifted, settling into something more deliberate, something that did not need to be rushed, and Amara did not respond immediately, her hands still moving lightly over the table as she sorted brushes and small jars of paint, her focus steady, but not distant, aware of him in the space without, letting his presence define it. And Ethan remained where he stood, not stepping further in, not retreating, simply holding his position in a way that respected the boundary she had not needed to repeat. The faint sound of children's voices drifted from the hallway again, softer now, echoing lightly through the space, and for a moment, it felt like the world outside this room had slowed, narrowed, allowing only what mattered to remain. Amara set one of the jars down carefully, her fingers lingering on the edge for just a second before she turned fully toward him, her posture straight, her expression calm, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same steady weight it always had, never raised, never rushed. "You cannot learn something like this in a day," she said, not dismissing, not inviting, simply stating a truth that did not need to be argued, and Ethan nodded slightly, accepting it without hesitation, because he understood now that this was not about proving something quickly, It was about showing something consistently, something that could not be measured in hours or even days. "I am not here for a day," he replied, his tone even, not pressing, just aligning with the reality she had set in front of him, and her gaze held his for a moment longer, searching, measuring something deeper than the words themselves, and in that silence, something shifted again, not visibly, not dramatically, just enough to move the moment forward without breaking it. A small sound at the doorway drew both of their attention, and Noah appeared there, his small frame partially hidden behind the edge of the wall, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Ethan, and for a second, he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of curiosity, as if deciding something for himself, and then he stepped fully into the room, his steps careful but not unsure, his gaze steady in a way that mirrored something Ethan knew too well. "Mom, I finished my drawing," Noah said, his voice soft but clear, holding up a piece of paper with both hands, the colors bright and uneven in the way only a child's work could be, and Amara's expression shifted slightly then, softening just enough to reflect the moment, her focus moving to him without losing awareness of everything else. "Let me see," she said gently, crouching down to his level, and as she took the paper, her attention became fully present, fully engaged, and Ethan watched, not from a distance this time, but from within the space, observing something that did not belong to him but that he was beginning to understand. The drawing was simple, a few shapes, lines that suggested buildings, a sun in the corner, and three figures standing side by side, uneven but connected, and Ethan's gaze lingered on it for a moment longer than he intended, because even in its simplicity, there was something there, something that spoke without explanation, and he felt it settle quietly into him before he looked away, not because it was too much, but because it was enough. "This is really good," Amara said softly, her voice warm, and Noah smiled, small but genuine, the kind of smile that did not seek approval but appreciated it. And then his gaze shifted again, landing back on Ethan, and this time, there was no hesitation. "Do you want to see it?" he asked, holding the paper out slightly, the gesture simple, open, and for a second, Ethan did not move, not because he did not want to, but because he understood the weight of that moment, the significance of being invited into something so small and so real, something that had nothing to do with business or negotiation or control, and everything to do with trust, even if that trust was not fully formed yet. He stepped forward slowly, careful not to rush the moment, and lowered himself slightly again, bringing his eyes level with Noah's, his posture open, his expression calm. "I would like that," he said, his voice softer than it had ever been, and Noah handed him the paper without hesitation, his small fingers brushing lightly against Ethan's for just a second before pulling back, and the contact was brief, almost nothing, but it lingered in a way Ethan did not expect. He looked at the drawing again, this time more closely, taking in the uneven lines, the bright colors, the way the figures stood together, and for a moment, he did not speak, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that this was not a moment for polished responses, it was a moment for honesty. "I like how you drew the sky," he said finally, his tone simple, genuine, and Noah nodded, satisfied, his attention already shifting forward again, the moment complete in his mind in a way that did not require anything more. Amara watched the exchange quietly, her expression unreadable, but there was something there, something subtle, something that had not been present before, not acceptance, not rejection, just awareness, and Ethan felt that too, the slight shift, the small movement of a line that had not yet been fully crossed but was no longer fixed in place. He handed the drawing back carefully, his movements deliberate, and as he stood again, the room seemed to settle into a different kind of quiet, one that did not carry tension, but possibility, and for a moment, none of them spoke, the space holding everything that had just happened without needing to define it. "You should go," Amara said after a few seconds, her voice calm, not pushing him out, but guiding the moment to its natural close, and Ethan nodded, not resisting, not lingering beyond what was appropriate, because he understood now that leaving was not the same as walking away, not when the intention remained, not when the presence would return. He glanced once more at Noah, who had already moved back toward the table, his focus returning to something new, his world continuing without interruption, and then he looked at Amara, meeting her gaze with a quiet acknowledgement that did not need to be spoken. "I will be back," he said, not as a promise she had to accept, not as a statement she had to respond to, just as something that existed, something that would be proven over time rather than words, and she did not answer, did not confirm or deny. She simply held his gaze for a second longer before turning slightly, her attention shifting back to Noah, back to the life she had built, and Ethan understood that too. Understood that this was not about what she said, it was about what he would do next, and as he stepped out of the room, moving through the quiet space of the center and back into the open air of the city, the weight of everything he had seen and felt did not fade. It settled, deeper, steadier, shaping something inside him that had not existed before, something that did not need urgency to move forward, only consistency, and this time, he was ready to give it. The door closed behind him with a quiet finality that did not feel like an ending, only a pause, and as Ethan stepped back onto the sidewalk, the cool air settled against his skin in a way that felt sharper than before, not because the temperature had changed, but because something inside him had, something that made every detail of the world around him more defined, more present, and he stood there for a moment, just outside the building, his hand resting briefly against the railing, grounding himself in the stillness before moving again. The city continued as it always did, indifferent to the shift in his world, cars passing, voices blending into a steady rhythm, and yet, for Ethan, everything moved differently now, not faster, not slower, just with a clarity he had not noticed before, as if he was no longer moving ahead of everything, but within it. He walked without calling for his driver, his steps steady along the sidewalk, and for the first time in years, there was no urgency pulling him forward, no schedule dictating his pace, only a quiet understanding that what mattered now could not be rushed, could not be forced into the structure he had relied on for most of his life. Days began to pass in a pattern that felt unfamiliar but intentional, each morning starting without the immediate pressure of decisions that affected entire industries, each afternoon finding him closer to the edges of a world he had once been entirely removed from, and the community center became a place he returned to, not every hour, not in a way that imposed, but consistently enough that his presence became something that existed rather than interrupted. He did not always go inside. Sometimes he remained across the street, watching from a distance, observing the rhythm of the place, the way children came and went, the way Amara moved through the space with quiet authority, the way Noah existed within it. Not searching, not waiting, simply living in a way that made Ethan understand the depth of what he had missed. Other times, he would step inside, always announced, always measured, never assuming access, and each time, the distance between them shifted slightly, not dramatically, not enough to erase the years that stood between them, but enough to show movement, enough to show that presence, when steady, could begin to reshape what had once been fixed. Noah grew used to seeing him, not as someone who belonged, but as someone who was there, and that difference mattered, because there was no expectation in the boy's gaze, no demand for explanation, only a gradual acceptance that this man appeared, spoke gently, and left without disruption, and Ethan understood that this was how trust began, not with declarations, not with explanations, but with consistency. Amara remained steady through it all, her posture unchanged, her voice always calm, never offering more than what was necessary, never pulling him closer, but no longer pushing him away in the same way she had at the beginning. And that subtle shift did not go unnoticed. It settled into Ethan as something fragile, something that required careful attention, because he understood now that progress here was not measured in words. It was measured in what was allowed to exist without resistance. One afternoon, as the light filtered through the windows in soft gold lines, Ethan found himself seated at one of the small tables inside the center, a stack of paper in front of him, a few markers scattered across the surface, and Noah sat across from him, his small hands moving with focused precision as he colored inside the uneven lines of a drawing that had not yet taken full shape, and Ethan mirrored the posture unconsciously, leaning slightly forward, his movements slower, more deliberate than anything he had ever done in a boardroom, and for a moment, the simplicity of it felt more complex than any deal he had ever closed. "You have to stay inside the lines," Noah said suddenly, his voice matter of fact, not instructive, just sharing something he believed to be true, and Ethan glanced down at his own paper, where the color had drifted slightly beyond the edge of a shape, and he nodded once, accepting the observation without correction. "I see that," he replied, his tone calm, and Noah looked up briefly, studying him for a second before returning to his work, satisfied with the response. And something about that small exchange settled deeper than it should have, because it was not about the drawing. It was about the interaction, the way it existed without pressure, without expectation, just two people sharing a moment that did not need to be defined to matter. Amara watched from across the room, her attention divided between the other children and the scene unfolding at the table, her expression still, unreadable. But there was something in the way she did not interrupt, something in the way she allowed the moment to exist, that spoke louder than anything she had said before, and Ethan felt that too. The quiet permission, not granted, but no longer withheld in the same way. Time moved differently in that space. Minutes stretching without tension, conversations rising and falling without urgency. And when the afternoon began to close, when the children gathered their things and voices softened into farewells, Ethan stood, not lingering beyond what was natural, not forcing another moment where one was not needed. And he looked at Noah, who was already slipping his drawing into a worn folder, his movements practiced, routine. "Good job today," Ethan said, his voice steady, and Noah nodded once, the small gesture carrying more weight than a longer response ever could, because it was simple, it was real, and it was enough. As Ethan turned to leave, his gaze met Amara's across the room, and for a second, the space between them held something new, not resolution, not even understanding, but acknowledgement, something quiet, something steady, and she gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to mark the moment, enough to show that something had shifted, however slightly, however carefully. And Ethan carried that with him as he stepped back into the city, not as a victory, not as a conclusion, but as proof that what he was building here, slowly, patiently, was real. And this time, he was not going to let it slip away. The rhythm of his days continued to shift in ways Ethan no longer resisted, and what had once felt unfamiliar had begun to settle into something steadier, something that did not require him to question every step, because the pattern was no longer about efficiency. It was about presence, and presence had a different kind of weight, one that could not be measured in outcomes, but only in consistency. The community center had become part of that rhythm now, not as a destination he forced into his schedule, but as a place he moved toward naturally. And each time he walked through its doors, there was less distance between him and the life inside, not erased, but adjusted, reshaped through repetition rather than words. On a late afternoon when the sky outside had softened into a pale gray, the kind that hinted at rain without committing to it, Ethan stepped inside to find the room quieter than usual. The tables cleared, the scattered supplies neatly arranged, and only a few children remaining, their voices low, focused, and at the far end, near the window, Noah sat alone, his small frame bent slightly over a book, his fingers tracing the edge of the page as he followed along with careful attention. Amara stood nearby, sorting through a stack of papers, her movement steady, and when she noticed Ethan enter, her gaze lifted briefly, meeting his with the same calm awareness that had defined every interaction between them. But there was something different now, not in her expression, but in the absence of resistance, the quiet acknowledgement that his presence no longer disrupted the space in the way it once had. Ethan did not speak right away, did not move directly toward them. He simply stepped further inside, allowing the moment to settle naturally. And after a second, Noah looked up, his eyes finding Ethan without hesitation, and a small shift occurred, subtle but clear, the kind of recognition that came not from surprise, but from familiarity, and he closed his book carefully, his posture straightening as he watched. "Hi," Noah said, his voice simple, unforced, and Ethan felt that word settle into him with a weight that felt disproportionate to its size, because it was not the word itself, it was what it represented, a shift from curiosity to acknowledgement, from observation to presence, and he nodded slightly in return. "Hi," Ethan replied, his tone gentle, grounded, and he moved closer this time, not hesitating, not waiting for permission that was no longer withheld in the same way. And he took a seat across from Noah, his posture relaxed but attentive, mirroring the boy's quiet focus without overwhelming it. Amara remained where she was, her attention still divided between her work and the space around her. But Ethan noticed the way her movements slowed slightly, the way her awareness remained anchored to them even as she continued sorting papers. And that awareness did not feel like control anymore. It felt like presence, something shared rather than guarded. "What are you reading?" Ethan asked after a moment, his voice low, and Noah turned the book slightly so it faced him. The pages filled with simple illustrations, bright colors framing words that were still new enough to require effort, and Ethan leaned in just enough to see, not taking the book, not interrupting the rhythm, just observing. "It is about the sky," Noah said, his tone thoughtful, and Ethan nodded, glancing at the page where a wide stretch of blue curved over a small drawing of a city, and for a second, the simplicity of it felt deeper than it should have, because it reminded him of something he had once taken for granted, something he had never needed to explain or define. "Do you like it?" Ethan asked, and Noah considered the question for a second before nodding once. "It is big," he said, and Ethan smiled slightly, not at the answer, but at the way it was given, the way it captured something true without needing to be expanded. "It is," Ethan agreed, his voice quiet, and for a moment, they sat there in a shared stillness that did not need to be filled, the sound of light rain beginning to tap softly against the window, the rhythm gentle, steady, grounding the space in something calm. Amara moved then, stepping closer, her presence settling beside Noah in a way that felt natural, and she placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, her touch brief but anchoring, and Ethan felt that too, the balance she maintained, the way she allowed the moment while still holding it steady, and for a second, their eyes met again, and this time, there was something there that had not been before, not acceptance, not yet, but something closer, something that no longer held the same distance it once had. "It is time to go," she said softly to Noah, her voice warm, and he nodded, closing the book carefully, his small fingers pressing it shut with intention, and as he stood, he looked briefly at Ethan, not searching, not questioning, just acknowledging, and that small moment carried more weight than anything else could have, because it was unforced, it was real, and it belonged entirely to him. Ethan stood as well, not stepping forward, not reaching out, just allowing the moment to unfold, and as Noah moved toward the door with Amara, their steps steady, their rhythm unchanged, Ethan followed at a respectful distance, not close enough to intrude, not far enough to disappear, simply present, and when they reached the entrance, Amara paused, turning slightly toward him, her expression calm, her posture composed, and for a second, the quiet returned again, the same stillness that had marked every turning point between them. "He has school tomorrow," she said, her voice even, not as a barrier, but as a fact, and Ethan nodded, understanding what she meant without needing further explanation, because this was not about access, it was about structure, about respecting the life that existed beyond his presence. "I will not interfere," he replied, his tone steady, and she held his gaze for a moment longer, measuring something deeper than the words themselves, before giving a small nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to acknowledge that something had shifted again, quietly, steadily, and as she turned, guiding Noah out into the soft rain, Ethan remained inside for a second longer, watching as they stepped into the gray light, their figures moving together in a rhythm that had once existed, entirely without him, and now, slowly, carefully, he was learning how to walk beside it without breaking what had already been built. The rain followed them into the evening, not heavy, not urgent, just steady enough to soften the edges of the city and quiet the noise that usually filled the space between moments. And Ethan stepped outside the community center a few seconds after they did, not to catch up, not to interrupt, but to remain within reach of something that was no longer distant, something that had begun to take shape in ways he could feel even when nothing was being said. Amara walked with Noah beneath a small umbrella, her hand steady in his, her pace unhurried, and the rhythm between them remained unchanged, consistent, grounded in years that had passed without him, and Ethan matched that pace again, a few steps behind, not hidden, not intruding, simply present in a way that did not demand acknowledgement, but did not disappear either. The streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, creating long, blurred streaks of light beneath their feet, and for a moment, the world felt quieter than it should have, like the city itself had slowed just enough to let this moment breathe. Noah tilted his head slightly upward, watching the rain fall against the edge of the umbrella, his attention caught by the simple movement of water and light. And then he spoke, his voice soft but clear in the stillness. "Mom, can we walk slower?" he asked, not out of fatigue, but out of curiosity, wanting to stay in the moment a little longer, and Amara glanced down at him, her expression softening just slightly before she nodded. "We can," she said gently, adjusting her pace without hesitation, and Ethan noticed that too. The way she adapted without effort, the way her presence was not fixed but responsive, and something about that settled deeper into him than anything else had that day. They reached the corner where the sidewalk narrowed, forcing them closer together for a few steps, and Ethan instinctively slowed, allowing the space to remain theirs. But Noah glanced back then, his eyes finding Ethan with a familiarity that no longer felt uncertain, and he hesitated for a second before speaking again. "Do you like the rain?" Noah asked, his tone curious, open. And Ethan paused slightly, not because he did not know the answer, but because he understood that this was not about the question, it was about the moment being offered. "I do," Ethan said after a second, his voice calm, and Noah nodded, satisfied, his attention returning to the way the water traced patterns along the sidewalk, and the conversation ended as simply as it had begun, but it left something behind, something quiet, something real. Amara did not speak during that exchange, but Ethan could feel her awareness, not watching closely, not intervening, just present, allowing the moment to exist without shaping it. And for the first time, that silence felt different, not guarded, not protective in the same way, but open enough to let something new take root without forcing it. They reached the brownstone again, the small light by the door glowing softly against the rain, and Amara paused at the steps, turning slightly toward Ethan, her expression steady, her posture unchanged. But there was something there now, something subtle that had not been present before, not in words, not in action, but in the absence of resistance that had once defined every boundary. Noah shifted beside her, his small hand still in hers, and he looked between them for a second before speaking again, his voice quiet but certain. "Will you come tomorrow?" he asked, the question simple, unguarded, and Ethan felt it settle into him in a way that nothing else had. Because this time, it was not about presence being tolerated, it was about presence being noticed, even expected in some small way, and he did not answer immediately, not because he did not want to, but because he understood the weight of what he said next. "If that is okay," Ethan replied, his voice gentle, his gaze shifting briefly to Amara, not asking for permission directly, but acknowledging that this moment did not belong to him alone, and the silence that followed stretched just enough to hold meaning, not tension, but consideration. Amara looked at Noah first, her expression softening in a way that was almost imperceptible, and then she lifted her gaze to Ethan, holding it for a second longer than she had before, and something in that look carried more than words could have, something that acknowledged everything that had changed, everything that had not, and everything that still stood between them. "We will see," she said quietly, her voice even, but the tone had shifted, not closed, not distant, just no longer fixed in the same place it had been when this began, and Ethan nodded once, accepting that, not as uncertainty, but as progress, because he understood now that nothing here would be given quickly, everything would be built, slowly, carefully, with time. Noah nodded as well, satisfied with the answer, and Amara guided him up the steps, the door opening with a soft click before closing again, leaving Ethan standing in the rain, the sound steady against the pavement, the city moving around him in quiet motion, and for a moment, he did not move, not because he was unsure of what came next, but because he was certain in a way he had not been before. He turned eventually, stepping back onto the sidewalk, the rain brushing lightly against his coat, and as he walked away, there was no sense of loss in the distance, no urgency to close the space immediately, only a steady understanding that what he had begun here was not something that would be finished quickly, but it was something real, something worth staying for, something worth building without shortcuts. The following morning came with clearer skies. The rain washed away, leaving the city sharp and bright under the rising sun, and Ethan stood outside the community center once more, not hesitating, not waiting, simply present. And when the door opened, and Noah stepped out beside Amara, his eyes lifted immediately, searching, finding, and when they landed on Ethan, something small but undeniable shifted in the air, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to mark the moment as different from all the ones before it. Noah smiled then, small, quiet, but real, and Ethan felt it settle into him with a clarity that left no room for doubt. This was no longer just a question waiting for an answer. It was something already taking shape, something that had begun to exist in the space between them, and this time, he was not going to